Welcome to the Enrichment Today Podcast, hosted by Dr. Amy Blansit and the Drew Lewis Foundation. This podcast covers topics to improve stability and find tranquility in your life. Join us as we discuss topics to improve your financial health, change your limiting beliefs, increase your wellness, and so much more. If you like Enrichment Today, make sure to follow the Drew Lewis Foundation and Enrichment Today on social media. Now sit back, relax, and learn to break some crayons with us.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Dr. Amy Blansit, and you're joining us on Enrichment Today Podcast. So today we have a topic that is somewhat uncomfortable in conversation. It's one that when it's brought up, people might be even confused about the meaning of it. So today we're going to launch into DEI. We're going to be looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and what it means in our community, why it's important in the nonprofit sector, but really why it's important to have just basic idea of how to have this conversation, not feel uncomfortable, it not be awkward. It's something that all of us need to be paying attention to. So I have some guests today. With me is Chelsea Caceras. She is Professor of Leadership Studies at Drury University. And I have Ramon Martinez, who is the creator, the founder of the nonprofit Career Academy. Nearly a decade of work into that project that he has brought to the Drew Lewis Foundation. And we have been launching this collectively with our team. And we are just started the third cohort. So it's been an amazing process to really look at, what the nonprofit sector is missing and how we can fill some gaps there. So today I want to start just by having both Chelsea and Ramon talk about why are they here at the table. And I also want to point out the obvious. You have two white female who are launching into this conversation. And sometimes that in itself feels awkward on why is it important for me to speak up? And what are ways that we can engage even when we, on the outside, may not represent what a lot of people think DEI means. So we have Ramon, who then we say is, like the token person who's bringing some, diversity to the conversation. But we'll dig into some of that and why we all do have a voice and why that voice is so important when we're talking about DEI. So both of you, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Talk about just briefly kind of why you're here at the table about DEI in our community.
So Chelsea Caceras here. This is something I've been super passionate about as someone who is a member of the LGBTQ plus community as a pansexual and someone who also has been marginalized because of mental health issues. I knew that I wanted to get into DEI work, and this opportunity came out at Drury for me to start teaching in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program.
And that's a certificate program. Students actually take specific courses in order to get a certificate.
Yes, so it's actually, there's a certificate, but then it can also be part of the Master in Integrative Leadership program. I teach 603 and 604, 603 being social justice and organizations, and 604 being capstone. This is my second year of teaching multiplicity classes, and maybe later on I'll share some things that our students have worked on.
Absolutely. You've got some amazing stories that we do want to share and how they relate with what we're talking about today. Ramon.
I would believe it's for three reasons. The first is when I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, I served for 20 years. During that time frame, there were only 0.5% of Latinos or officers in the United States Air Force. So it was extremely difficult to be able to excel under conditions like that. The second position was when I retired from the Air Force, the very next day I was working for a nonprofit organization that dealt with DNA testing. So from then on, my career track has been working with underserved populations and trying to help them out in those situations. The third reason is because of the Nonprofit Career Academy. It's one of the lessons that we've installed into the Nonprofit Career Academy, and I think it's one that's very relevant for now and very compelling. Those are the three reasons.
Absolutely. And today we're going to, keep bringing in this Nonprofit Career Academy and why it's so important when we are we're training individuals who are going to be at the forefront of mostly marginalized populations when we were talking about the nonprofit missions. And so having this as a lesson of how do you have those conversations? How do you also be at the forefront of making people feel included Many also operate in the world of healthcare and resources. So equity comes apart, and then, fractional, those very small margins of individuals, as you mentioned with Air Force, 0.5% thriving. Those conversations become important too, of how do we build that empowerment in individuals who have maybe been marginalized for so many years. So really excited to have this conversation with both of you. So let's start with simply, how do we define DEI? And group by group, conversation by conversation, that definition can change, right? It's flux, it's evolving. So specifically, we're going to think about today with the Nonprofit Career Academy, with your education, at Drury, why is it important that we are layering this in as we're training individuals in such amazing career paths that they've chosen? Chelsea, we'll start with you, and then Ramon, if you'll follow in.
So diversity, it's actually infinite. And a lot of people think that it's only about marginalized individuals, but it's actually about the majority too. So diversity is inclusive of everyone, and it's available, it's present in all organizations. You just have to know how to tap into that. Equity, a great way to think about this is to, we're giving everyone a pair of shoes. Equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that fit. So again, you mentioned resources, and that's where the equity pays in. Inclusion is a choice, and it's, we get down into Nancy Schlossberg's theory of marginality and mattering, and the purpose of inclusion, you're trying to make your team members, individuals, feel like they are welcome, they're belonging, like they belong. They feel psychologically safe to be themselves. They don't have to cover any of their identities should they have multiple marginalized identities. And it's important to have in the community, in the government, anywhere, to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, because we're all unique, even if you are not brown and black. We all have multiple identities. So I'll pass it on to you.
Sure. The way I see diversity, equity, and inclusion are what I would call programs du jour. And that means that these are programs that people come up with, and in many cases or many instances don't understand what those three terms mean, but it's the thing to do at the time. Diversity, I see it as part of resilience, building resilience. And the reason why you want diversity is that you need different species in a system or in an environment. Just as in organizations, you need different perspectives, different experiences, different backgrounds, different culture that bring in that richness that help to expand a nonprofit organization in particular, or a company. Inclusiveness is the distinction is that not all diverse populations are inclusive, or organizations are inclusive. So you can bring in a quota. You can have, I need to bring in 10% of other people in. That doesn't mean that you're going to make them feel that they're belonging, right? So inclusiveness is, how do we bring them in and then make them feel at home, make them feel that they're part of this organization? How do we share responsibilities with them so that they can make decisions and also grow with the organization? Equity is also part of resilience. But the way I see equity is more as the two sides of a coin. And that is, equality is one side of a coin. That coin is called justice. The other side is equity. Equality is where when you start an institution, you distribute burdens and benefits equally because you're just starting that institution. But when the institution brings out policies, then somehow the results, the outcomes become skewed. And so what you do is, equity is the attempt to redress that, to fix that underserved capacity that other people have as a result of not being able to get fair burdens and benefits.
Burdens and benefits. That's the first time I've heard it said like that, that shared burden and benefit. one of the things that keeps coming back to me in conversations I'm involved in is a sense of community and the sense of belonging. Francine Pratt has started saying, instead of people of color, that it's people of culture. And that diversity, as you had mentioned, Chelsea, is not this idea that it's this population or percentage of people that we want to identify like this, but instead, if we can remove even sometimes color from it, because the idea is culturally we identify. Culturally, maybe we live in the same community and we're fighting for the same social justice thing. And so I wish I had come up with it, but Francine Pratt gets amazing credit for that, of this idea of culturally, how can we identify and remove these other components? And I think, Chelsea, then that is where you and I do have a voice and a seat at this table, because it's not just about what is the color of my skin, but really this fight for culture that we want to create diversity, inclusion, so that there is that idea, can I understand you better, so that as a community, can we share those burdens together? Ramon, I really like that idea of that visualization of what that means. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is, why do so many people hesitate to even have conversation about DEI? Ramon, you want to launch with this one?
Sure. I think what happens is that organizations have a tendency to go along their way until there's a problem that crops up. And so what we find is that the people in organizations and companies have a tendency to focus on stability and that nothing changes. And what happens is life is not like that. It's when you live life, you undergo and you go sufferings. There's problems that crop up and how to deal with that. And so what happens is that people, because they believe so much in stability, which is more of an illusion, is change is happening every day and problems are cropping up, then we latch on to this terminology of DEI and then try to see, well, how can we implement that in their lives without talking about, well, what's the concept? What does it mean? How do we define it? And these issues are very contentious. The case in point is equity. It's a very contentious issue where people don't understand what that means. I saw a show on Bill Maher where Senator Bernie Sanders was there. And the question was, what's equity? And Bernie Sanders attempted, and then he said, I really don't know. So if our senator doesn't know, then society-wide, we're having this issue. And this is why it's so important, is let's talk about, what does diversity really mean? How do we apply it? What is equity? How do we do that?
Yeah. It's actually that point that you make on him saying, I don't know, but also what a big point for him to not jumble something up and try to have an answer, but to say, I don't know. And I think that's the point of why is it so difficult to have these conversations? Because in the workforce, like you said, there's a problem that's arisen. We haven't had conversation about it. Now there's conflict and we don't know. And because we don't know, we often word jumble and try to have the answer. I like to say verbal vomit. So, we just, whatever comes out and you're like, wait, I want to take that back. I don't know. And that's why these conversations are so important. You have something to add?
Yeah, Bernie admitting that he didn't know, that's actually part of being an inclusive leader.
Yes.
Because he's being vulnerable. He's being authentic. He's saying that he doesn't know. And I think it's also hard, for people to get into it just because they don't understand the different terminology. Or they have this idea that diversity, again, it's just about marginalized individuals, and it's not. It's about everyone, and it's not just physical diversity, it's cognitive diversity as well. So you have to make sure that you are bringing people on teams and including people who not just look differently, but think differently, and you're avoiding groupthink. And, there's several benefits to looking into cognitive diversity. And some of these things that we have mentioned already, like psychological safety and Nancy Schlossberg's marginality and mattering, they've been around for a long time. They're just now coming out. So they're just now being celebrated. So psychological safety was a term that came out in the 1960s, and we just saw it come back in the 90s. And now there are leadership consulting firms that focus on psychological safety and helping organizations make their team members feel welcome and safe in the workplace. And I think that's that's becoming more of,
what's the word? Help me out here. As far as like more normative.
Yeah, becoming more of a focus because we're having all just DEI work that's being highlighted. But it's also important to note that it's not just a quick fix. Diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a long-term, ongoing educational process.
Right.
You can't just have a diversity training, a one and done. That's
Absolutely.
They have to be little and often. And
and that's why diversity, and inclusion at these equity conversations in a class like the Nonprofit Career Academy, the more times that we can introduce it, the more times that we can have individuals say, I don't know, like, what does that feel like? We're, as I mentioned, mostly in the nonprofit world, we are looking at individuals that have some problem within their community that they're not able to navigate something. We've created an entity around that problem to help create solution, and educating the individuals who are going to be leaders in that, right? You're working for a nonprofit, you're looked up to as innovators, individuals that are willing to do something different to fill the gap. It's really important to have these conversations. So Ramon, with the Nonprofit Career Academy, the way that this has been woven in, the students are going to view this podcast and some additional material in order to begin to create some dialogue. Can you kind of talk to us about how it's been shaped into the curriculum without it being this forced, you must have DEI and you must be aware of what all this means, but instead, as you mentioned, Chelsea, it's the conversation that's woven into all the things that we do, not a one and done type of project.
At the Nonprofit Career Academy, this particular topic is part of the introduction to nonprofit sector. What we try to do is to bring out the fact is that there are parts to leadership, and part of that is motivation. When we look at DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, it forms part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that is that part of feeling a belongingness to the organization. It's also the attempt for people to have to create a better self-esteem, and also to enable them and empower them to go towards self-fulfillment. But you can't do that if you don't have these programs into your organization. The challenge for nonprofit organization, not just for the individual, but for the nonprofit organization itself, is how do you create those conditions whereby people are empowered to do that? That's the big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. The word empowerment, the word, esteem, this idea that if we can help leaders understand awareness, just, to take a moment and think about the language that we're using, the words that maybe the way it's always been written excludes a population that we just didn't know maybe now has a need, or maybe culturally, we work with this to where culturally there are different individuals who are going to not ask for help because that is just something you don't do, right? And so even having that, maybe now that cultural shift has changed, there is a new group that has come forward, and we've got to adjust the way that we're providing services in order to make sure that we're meeting them as they are, where they are. And if we're not creating leaders that are looking for that, we're really missing out on opportunities to serve individuals in our community, to build that esteem in them. And then again, the biggest thing is that empowerment, to simply know that I have people that regardless of who I am, they're coming alongside me. And that Maslow's, that sense of belonging of culturally, there are people who value me. And that in itself, especially in RISE and what we do at the Drew Lewis Foundation, has been such a pivotal point in individuals, that esteem and that idea of thriving. So, with nonprofits, we are serving populations that we say they're underserved, they're under-resourced, that look so many different ways. So again, I just want to continue to focus today on this idea about educating leaders in order to see and how that shapes. So our next question is, why have these types of conversations often kind of gotten to the point where individuals maybe don't feel represented by rules? Ramon, you had mentioned kind of this already the ideas of rules and policies, procedures don't represent me. So where are the most common areas that we're seeing this take place in our community?
I'd like to tie it in with what you previously said, and that is DEI is more about, I've said this for years, is a philosopher, Bacon, said, knowledge is power. I say shared knowledge is empowerment.
I like that.
So the difference then is with DEI is we need to share that knowledge in terms of what are the motivations that move people, motivate people to accomplish things. We also talk in terms of what are those virtues, those obligations, those values that are instilled in us so that we pursue the mission and vision of an organization rather than go on our own. So DEI has everything to do with virtue, which means to bring out the best in us, the excellence. Obligations, really what that does, it demonstrates to us that we need to be self-aware, meaning we need to be aware of our environment and that there are others and stop focusing on us. When you work in a nonprofit organization, you're there to create, deliver, capture, and enhance values for a customer or a client or a patient. It's not about you. It's about the other person who is in need. And that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion are so important, because how do I get to understand the needs of that other individual? How do I get the compassion? So it's not merely sympathy. It's how do I feel, understand what they feel, and then take action to alleviate that problem. Sympathy is just, I acknowledge you have a problem.
Right.
Empathy is, yeah, you have a problem, but I don't do anything. Compassion is, you've got a problem. I feel what you feel, but I'm going to help you fix this problem.
Right. Yeah. And I think the DEI conversation is almost easier in the nonprofit world because, again, like I mentioned, we are seeking out individuals who have fallen in a gap of some sort. And we always are looking at how do we lift that individual up, or how do we provide services, resources, education, mental health, so that individual is empowered to do it, on their own. But it's always a sense of community that comes around individuals. So we kind of get to have the DEI conversation without labeling it DEI every day. And that is what I love about the work that I get to do with Drew Lewis Foundation, is we constantly are saying, okay, who doesn't have what, and how do we wrap around them? One of my favorite things is an individual who comes in and is like, I've tried everything. You people, I'm here, but I'm going to keep you at an arm's length. I don't trust you. And then for that person to just eventually be like arms wide open because they have found a place that they trust us, we trust them, and they have found their people. And to see that human being go from so just stone cold to being just so warmly embraced and embracing others, it's why I do what I do, because it is so amazing when you get to experience that. And the fact that we're even having conversation about this being a political issue that we can't talk about means that someone out there has never seen that. They haven't been a part of witnessing someone else's life change like that. And so to me, the reason of having these conversations is everyone should feel that. Everyone should have their community that kind of binds and supports them, and all the terms you're using with that idea of like mission and virtue, like that is what DEI is about. And that's why I'm so excited to be able to bring it forward with Nonprofit Career Academy, the work that you're doing at Drury, and so many others in our community are doing. So we've talked about how often someone doesn't feel they have a seat at the table, they're not being represented through the organizational rules or policies, and that's generally when conflict arises. So what are some ways that you guys have seen this best navigated? Chelsea, if you want to start, I'm queuing you up to talk about the work and the research that you've been doing at Drury with students, right? And then Ramon, I want you to think about, in these leadership positions in the nonprofit world, But Chelsea, talk about where have you been able to kind of create that sense of community where the students feel finally heard, where maybe they've had to be very protective about who they are in order to be a student athlete, to be a student?
Right. So earlier we had mentioned Birdie being so honest, he didn't know questions. So something I'd start with at the beginning of the course is I let them know all of these different things about my identity. And they then feel that they can come to me at different times and reach out. So I do mention, I'm a pansexual, which means hearts, not parts. I do mention that I struggle with anxiety, depression, and ADHD. And I mentioned that I'm a divorcee and going through that. And so I'm just very open and honest with them, and they feel like, okay, this person, she's been through some things, and it's okay for me to open up. I also start with having them do some self-awareness activities, because that's so important in diversity, equity, inclusion. You have to be self-aware in order to be aware of others. And so we have a multicultural dimensions of self project where it forces them, I hate using forces, but it forces them to look at their in-groups and out-groups. So what are your in-groups made out of? Who are the people you normally surround yourself with? And then your out-groups. What race is your doctor? Like, who is your dentist? And, thinking about all of these things. And then it's kind of giving them an idea like, oh, my universe, my world is not as diverse as it could be. We want them to be self-aware and recognizing that there are things that they can be doing to have a more diverse environment.
Perfect. Yeah. So Ramon, in the kind of the nonprofit, the leadership aspect of it, the same, how have you seen ways that this is being navigated well?
I believe is more and more nonprofit organizations are beginning to establish guiding principles in their organization. And a lot of people don't understand that concept of guiding principles. And guiding principles are these principles that form, mold, shape the culture of an organization. Culture in an organization is the way we do business. That's what you're declaring out to the world. So guiding principles then are going to tell you, these are the values that we're pursuing. These are the virtues that we're going to instill upon us. These are the obligations that we're going to do amongst each other, because we rely on each other, because together we form the entire organization rather than individually. So it's that cohesiveness that you're trying to build. An example that I can give you is not a nonprofit, it's a for-profit.
And it takes all, right? I mean, we've got to have the public-private sector having these conversations and all of them making these decisions internally.
And it's a personal experience, and that is my son, who is the brand new Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Belongingness, is what they call it.
Oh, nice.
For the headquarters of Pizza Hut, which is in Plano, Texas. So his job is newly created. His job is to bring in, I think it's over 15,000 franchises, to talk about how the culture of the organization needs to be bring in people with very diverse backgrounds, but you need to also inculcate this feeling of belongingness. A lot of it is as a result of when you form a strategy, is everyone needs to be included into that and coordinate their activities and collaborate. So inclusiveness and diversity and equity have everything to do with that.
Yeah.
How do I get to implement a strategy if I don't include everyone into this? If I don't bring people's different perspective, allow them to give us a different point of view. Otherwise, you get what we call groupthink,
right,
which can lead you down to a lot of challenges.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when I bought the Fairbanks, luckily I had some good mentors. And it was a thing that I knew, but to hear it repeatedly was, even though I'd owned a house in the neighborhood, even though I had grown up in poverty, at that time, I no longer was. And I wasn't seen as someone, from the outside. People didn't know my story. So the conversation was, be careful that you're not doing stuff to people, but that you're doing stuff with people. And I was like, that kind of is my life. Luckily that I grew up in a family that my parents would see someone who didn't have family, and they not only were foster parents, but when my mom was going to school for her education degree, she would find a classmate that didn't have someone, like a home for Thanksgiving, and Praveen was coming home, and so we now have a long-term relationship with Praveen and his family. So diversity was a part of my parents' choice. Like, intentionally, they chose to introduce their children to Branson is not very, it's very homogenous. And so I was very lucky that my parents chose that. They were intentional about it. So here at the Fairbanks, doing work with one of the lowest income communities and one of the more diverse communities in Springfield, we started by having potluck dinner. We started by having an open house. We started by asking, like, what do you need? I had an idea of what this could be, but there was no, like, this is what we're going to do in this community because we know best. And it's that thing of, let's bring in the individuals who are suffering. Let's bring in the individuals who have the means and the methods, maybe the philosophies and the theories. But it needs to be that table where I feel comfortable sharing the ignorance that I have. That most of the DEI conversations I come to, I'm just saying, I'm here to learn. I'm here to share what I can. But I also come in a place of ignorance because I want to learn more. If I've done it wrong, point it out, and I want to do it better next time. And so, that's one of the things that we look at in this paradigm shift is, in the beginning, Ramon, you mentioned change is scary. Is there anything else that you want to add in that? So for me, I love change. If I'm doing the same thing every day, I'm bored. Give me knowledge, give me change. And I have to remember, for most individuals, that's terrifying.
Well, it's what you need to do is to be able to look at life and see how it unfolds. And what you find out is that independently of how you think, change is going to happen no matter what. But even with change, you still have the tools to be able to deal with that. Nature gives you those tools. It also can detract from what you're doing, but it also gives you the tools to carry those things out. So rather than fight change, is what you say, okay, I need to acknowledge that change is all around me, and that movement is going to help me to sustain healthy growth by accepting change. The challenge is, how do I deal with change? And that is in terms of flexibility of thought. It's being able to reason well, which is one of the courses that
Yes.
we teach at the Nonprofit Career Academy, is how to reason well, how to speak well, how to write well, so that you can communicate to others. One thing I wanted to bring up, which you were hitting at the surface, and that is, I've learned in my experiences as a consultant for strategy that the people on the front line are the one who know even more than the executives. Mm-hmm. They know the needs of the individuals that they're helping. So part of diversity and inclusiveness is bringing those people on the front line, and they can help you a lot in terms of developing a strategy. Generally, a lot of organizations do a top-down approach.
Yes.
My approach is bottom-up, because they're the ones who are in contact every day in that community. They know probably more than you do. They may not know how to run an entire organization, but in terms of the needs of the community, mm-hmm. that's where you go.
Yeah, that direct service that I have the information and the story. What do you think this conversation, becoming political, change is scary? Anything to add to that?
Do we want to jump into politics right now?
Well, that is my
kind of a loaded question.
That is my next question. If we are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion being this idea that everyone should be given a voice, and that after that there should also be listening, we are just simply talking about everyone has human rights. This is humanization. How is that political? Why have we gotten here? So yes, it was a perfect cue. You read it. That's where we were headed.
This is, oh my gosh. Okay, so just think of the history of the United States. What has happened? We've had white people come over and taken these indigenous lands, and from there we've decided that certain races are superior than others. And so politics has always been intertwined because our history has been just built on oppression and discrimination. When we're talking about equity, we want to make sure that people are treated the way they want to be treated. And some of those groups, those tribal groups, we've referred to them as Native Americans or American Indian or indigenous peoples, but they want to be referred to their tribal name. So then you're thinking about equity, and it's treating people how they want to be treated, not just how you want to be treated. So that's how we move away from equality. And right now, our political environment is just kind of all over the place. We have in Florida where they have passed a Don't Say Gay bill in elementary education, and now they're moving it into high schools. If you are a public institution, you cannot teach critical race theory, which is the idea that people have had different lived experiences because of their race. And even in Missouri, I'm going to check my notes here, we have the SB 410, which is the Do No Harm Act. Public institutions who require DEI education or training and awareness, they are at risk of losing their state funding if they include DEI, anything DEI related in their curriculum. So we're seeing a fight against inclusion in the United States. There are groups that have had laws against them, and then they've been given laws. Let's talk about same-sex marriage. And that was kind of on the table, it was made legal, and then, let's reverse that. Mm-hmm. And it's incredible that we would, as a country, not want to do things that benefit the majority, or not just the majority, that would benefit all.
Absolutely.
And when you talk about humanization, we are all humans, and so why would you want to do something or enable a policy or a law or an act that takes something away from another human?
Yeah.
Don't we all deserve to live and be ourselves
and thrive? That's the thing to me too. So I do want to mention, you mentioned SB 410. For those of you that aren't familiar, that's Senate Bill SB 410. So if you're interested in looking into that. But the idea of taking away from someone, to have a thriving country, we've got to have a thriving workforce. We've got to have thriving consumers. We have to have thriving communities. We have to have thriving home buyers. We have to have thriving, and this idea that I can marginalize a population, I can take things away from them, I can make you feel unwelcome, that you don't belong, but yet then I want you to contribute equally, or even more if we look at who's getting tax cuts right now, and that sort of thing. So for me, from the top, Ramon, you mentioned, bottom up and top down. From top down, when you're that disconnected, that you're like, why aren't you thriving? And yet you're not looking at the policies, the procedures, the conversation, the culture that's been created. If I don't belong, I'm not going to care about whether your company thrives. If I don't belong, I'm not going to care if there's trash on the street that I could have easily picked up or prevented. If I don't belong, right, we begin to see these things just tear away. And from the top, we're asking, why don't you do better? Why can't you pull yourself up from your bootstraps? And from the bottom, we're saying, how do you not see this? And it's really, continuing to have these conversations without using CRT and DEI. We just simply are talking about, how do we have conversations so that I understand you better so that my business can thrive because you're thriving? You can consume my product. I can make my product better for you because I understand you. And that product can be a nonprofit service. That product can be, for-profit, non-for-profit. It can just simply be, can I be a better neighbor to you? And that's kind of, what we're talking about here and what I really challenge people to think about. So one of the things that I really appreciate having this conversation is that I thought I was getting called into the principal's office, if you will, at the DEI dean at Missouri State was like, hey, urgent, I need to have a meeting with you. I was like, oh, what did I? Immediately I went, it's not impossible that maybe I offended someone. Maybe I said something different. Maybe I said something that was thought-provoking in class, but was edgy, and like someone took it to the principal's office. So I immediately thought, what have I done? I'm in trouble. And so, we go to them like, okay, when? So I go to this meeting, and he brings a graduate assistant with him, and she is also she's a different ethnicity, and I'm sitting at this table, I'm like, oh man, he can't even like talk in front of me without a witness. Like, what have I done? Turns out the opposite. They want me to speak at an event that's coming up. And it's a large event that they're really trying to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, but you do see the irony here, right? You're asking the most like white bread Missouri girl to lead a diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm confused. Like, now I'm just confused. I don't know what to say. How am I going to inspire anyone? And it was because they said, Amy, this is the problem. This is why we're asking you to speak. It isn't a color thing. This is a community, and this is a culture thing, and it's what you do every day. And so we want you to come to this in the sense of, it is important for individuals who don't look like they should be talking about DEI to be leading the conversation about DEI, about creating the table where people can come together and have these conversations safely and make mistakes and not feel stupid for it. And so instead I was like, oh, I'm not in trouble. Okay, you respect what I do, and and what I do matters. And so that was one of those things of like, now how do we talk about this? Not a black and brown and white issue, but instead, Ramon, you mentioned like policy, procedure, strategic planning. How does this become something where we're developing mission and value that humanize individuals and that help us create? Right now, our country is scary. We're seeing all of these issues with banks, and we're seeing issues with the rising inflation, and it's scary, right? And how do we not come together and say, you know what, we could humanize, we could create a culture that changes that?
First, to address the issue that you brought up about MSC, it so happens that the Drew Lewis Foundation, we're located, I may be mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, we're located in the poorest part of the entire city.
You are correct.
Which also means we're the most diversified
You are correct.
community in the entire city.
Yes.
So you're the perfect individual to do that, because how do you bring these people with diverse views, diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures to be able to work together to create something greater than they ever expected?
Absolutely.
So that's one thing. The other part is, I want to address that we've talked about as well, it is the either or thinking in politics.
Yeah.
And
The zero sum.
yes, and reasoning well is not like that.
Yeah.
Reasoning well is trying to get down to what is the problem, and then coming up with a claim that is warranted, that the grounds you give warrant the claim you're making. When you listen to politicians, there's a disconnect between a claim and that which is warranted.
Yeah.
So that's part of the issue. But that's why at the Nonprofit Career Academy, we're focusing on reasoning, because we know that if we can help develop that reasoning capacity from the students and then join the nonprofit organizations, they'll be able to reason a lot better and also push that organization to be able to articulate its mission, to know exactly what is the culture they're trying to build. So what are those virtues and obligations that they're trying to pursue, and values as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, that can we develop, and in the Nonprofit Career Academy, many of the individuals who complete that certification aren't going to go on to be the executive director in the next year or two. That's, we're looking at building that workforce that's more in supportive roles. But that leadership, that conversation can come from every level. And I think that's really important, that we're empowering everyone at every level in an organization to feel comfortable about those conversations. Chelsea, you mentioned zero sum, and that might be a term people haven't heard before. Do you mind just sharing quickly what you meant by that? And then you're jotting down some notes, so I want to give you the mic to process kind of some of those things that you're feeling.
So zero sum is just the idea that if one person wins, the other group doesn't. And we can't be focusing on zero sum games. You know, we want to look at everyone winning. Like if people from the bottom are doing great, that's great for the people at the top.
Yes.
And I'll jump into a little bit of a text that we use in one of my courses is by Stephen Frost, who was the director of DEI for the 2012 London Olympic Games and also the Paralympics. And he has his own leadership consultancy business called Frost Included, and they focus on training for white male leadership, because statistically white males, they'd have those executive positions. And when you're, if you're looking at having that DEI conversation with these uppers, these white males, you have to make it personal, and there has to be some self-reflection. So figure out a way to ask them, what is it that you're doing? How does this affect others? Or consider someone from a marginalized group and going through a certain experience, and then how would that make you feel? So we're turning it around. We're reframing diversity as a leadership concept. And then we were talking about seat at the table. So you had mentioned bottom up, and you had just said, Amy, that all levels should be available in the decision-making process. And that is true. And a way to do that is to either have employee resource groups or committees who are made up of diverse individuals, not just physical diversity, but cognitive as well. And they need to be part of the decision-making process.
Absolutely.
Because is it really realistic to have everyone involved in making the decisions? Probably not, but you could create these groups, right, that can then go back to their subcommittees and then, their teams, and then they're bringing things to the uppers.
Absolutely. But in the nonprofit world, one of the things, and actually, honestly, in the for-profit world, many for-profits also have a board of guidance and or education. And so one of the things that we see in so many of them is that an individual who is in their service realm, so we're going to serve and we create a mission, people that look like this, children that look like this need, often who is not at the table at a board level is the individual experiencing the problem, the gap that's being served. And from the beginning, one of the things that I'm so grateful is that the board with Drew Lewis Foundation, we identified that from the beginning. Like the 4 of us that started shaping it, we became the 5 of us, we became the 6 of us, and it was like, you know what, we can't answer the question. The questions we're asking, we don't have the really way to solve it without having someone at the table who every day is in crisis and chaos. And they're saying, Amy, that's a great idea, but guess what? I can't do that from 8 to 5 because I am working. So, that's one of the areas that we really look at in this idea of bringing everyone to the table, even at that highest level. Do we have the individuals whom we are serving there? That's DEI. That is just simply making sure that we're representing the population and that they are there and that they're helping us shape, because they also help us not waste a lot of time and a lot of money putting into, here's this new program we're going to do. Oh, guess what? We forgot this really important part of the cog, and now we've wasted time and resources because we're not serving in the way that individuals need us to serve them.
But it's also the case, from what you're saying, that it's not just about the people who work in a nonprofit organization. It's about your clients, and also giving them that knowledge being aware of other individuals different than them.
Yes.
And so it's not just giving them services that are going to help them, but it's how do we give them that knowledge so that they're able to say, yes, we have different people in our community. I need to help as well. I need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So that's what's the important things to.
Yeah, very good.
And having
No, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, having those diverse groups, those people that are making decisions, the more diverse your team is physically and cognitively, the more you're going to be able to see biases that come through your decisions or blind spots that are preventing an answer from being solved. And I think someone had mentioned it earlier, just the benefits of having multiple perspectives.
Yeah. Creating a better product. I mean, this is the other thing I don't understand when people are resistive to saying, how do we do better? How do we talk about what culture we're missing? You're missing a market. Like from the top, you should be saying, hey, if we're only over here looking exactly like this, doing the thing we've always done, and the population you are serving every year is changing, every day is changing, you literally are sinking your business. Like you could be selling more widgets, you could be serving more people, you could be. So to me, from a business, like I'm a business person, I want to be ahead of the game. I want to be thinking about who is the person that's going to buy my product. And my product might be education. My product might be service. I've got to do it better than everyone else in the nonprofit world because I'm asking for people to see the value so we can continue to serve. But in the business world, when you're talking about simply capitalism and I've got to have the best widget, you literally are missing the market. You are selling yourself short. You are missing out on money because you choose to be blind to all these things and afraid to have these conversations. So fine, you're going to go out of business. Great. Because, we need less of that. So it's, again, it's about innovation when we're talking about this.
The way I look at it is for-profit and nonprofits share a common backing. That backing is they're in business to sustain healthy growth, the healthy growth of their organization, not necessarily the customers,
right?
The organization. If you say, I need to sustain the healthy growth of an organization and the board and the employees are focused on that, then they'll always have to ask the question, things are changing. How do I sustain healthy growth within that change? Which means I need to review and see what services are we missing out on? What services do we need to create and develop?
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the issue is that, again, they focus on stability. They're saying we've been growing in this fashion for such a long time. We don't need to change.
Yep.
Well, change is going to pass.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
As you mentioned, it is more cost beneficial for an organization on our business to be diverse. Mentioned earlier, diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice, and there are statistics that show that when diversity is included, it's better for customers and engagement and productivity and decision making. And even thinking about like authenticity around inclusion, that drives engagement. And when you are talking about sustainability, we're looking at maybe like homogenous talent management. Instead, we should be looking at inclusive talent management. So managing and accounting for people and their benefits from difference. And I think a lot of times that just gets surpassed in several businesses or industries.
So yeah, so we are. I could continue having this conversation with you two all day long. It's stuff that I really like talking about. Again, I realize I probably stumble. I say it wrong. I'm probably going to offend someone today. But that's that part of it. Okay, let's have a conversation. What did I say that you kind of were like, oops, I don't like that. And I want to know what that is, and I want to continue. But we do have a timeline that we gotta meet. There's the last thing I want to talk about is there are a lot of different images that show the idea of equity versus equality. You mentioned the shoes. I think that's such a simple thing. Everyone gets a size 10 and you got a pair of shoes. Why aren't you happy about it? Well, I'm a 7.5. So there's images of people standing on boxes to see over a fence. There's images in the health world. We use one of bicycles. And so can everyone engage in activity? So one of the things that also in those images, the idea that the one widget isn't the right fit for everyone. The one other area that I identify with, because if you knew my mother, you would know exactly this one, the women in the workplace. So she is 80 and she grew up in this idea of like, you were going to be a wife, a hairdresser, or, there's not much else for you. And by God, she did not like that answer. But it took her until her 40s in order to really empower herself to never have to rely on my father should she choose not to. But it was more important to her in the idea of like, I can contribute and I have value and I want to share that value. And so even when we're talking about that equity, it's also having a woman's voice at the table. And so we've talked a lot about color, we've talked a lot about culture, but there's also just making sure that we are representing gender and choices and identities that come in that as well. So I had to shout that out to my mother because, that is her area of empowerment. So today we talked a lot about words. We've talked about ways that many of us kind of avoid the discussions, but you can see today it was so easy. We all had so much to say. We were, we were all willing to have the conversation, which is so much more than I want to say. I know. Well, so I'm going to ask you, that's what I'm going to wrap up around, is we've had really healthy conversation today because that's our perspective. Others might not agree with our conversation today, and that's their perspective, but the three of us would invite them to the table to have more conversation. And I think that's what's important. If you're not even willing to have the conversation, there's that self-reflection that you talked about, right? Where are you coming from? So I want to give you each just an opportunity to kind of summarize the things we didn't get to share. You've talked about empathy and the stories that you hear, right? That's a big part too of listening and learning from others. So if you each want to take a couple minutes to wrap up with anything that we didn't ask or the things that you've kind of been jotting notes about today.
Do you can start?
Sure. The hardest concept of the three is equity. And so I want to be able to address the issue of equity. Equity happens when an institution, the resources and the outcomes are unfair. And so it's an attempt to readdress or to redress those unfair burdens and benefits that have been passed on to people who are going underserved inequalities. The case in point is the example we have of the little snapshot of the people looking at the baseball game, where they have different assistants to help them to be able to see the game. What's not drawn in there is the fact is that they're looking at it from the outside. They're not in the stadium. They don't have the resources to be able to see the game. So essentially they have to cheat in order to see that, right? Yeah. So the system is not helping them. So equity is more than just, let's put them so that they're all equal. Equity is about what do we need to do so that we can readdress that unfair burdens and benefits so that people have sufficient resources to be able to sustain healthy growth in their life. That's what equity is about. How do we provide sufficient resources, sufficient support, sufficient knowledge, sufficient capacity to sustain healthy growth on your own? That's what equity is all about.
Yeah. Ramon, something simple on why these conversations are so important. I've seen this image so many different times. I've discussed it. I use it in my class. Never once has someone just simply said, I've heard people say, just let's take down the fence, right? But never say, well, isn't the next step really that they should have a seat in the stadium? Like there should be a little arrow and it should be like, look at them having the, American dream and the hot dog and with their family. So why are these conversations important? right? I never saw it from this person's perspective saying, well, this is nice, I can see now, but it'd be really nice if I could afford the ticket to go into the game. And that's why just that one statement has changed my perspective. And that's why these conversations are so valuable. Awesome. Chelsea, what do you want to add?
All right, so I can get into systems change process, but that's something that we focus on in social justice and organizations and the DEIO 603 course, part of the diversity certificate. And what that's saying is that in order to invoke true change in an organization, you have to look at the culture and you have to have all systems involved, because you're not just having one person. Let's say a DEI position is created. You cannot rely on just that person.
Absolutely.
DEI committee, you cannot just rely on that DEI committee. And then if we're offering trainings or educational programming, it has to be ongoing. It is an ongoing educational process. And again, in order to be inclusive, you have to make sure that your team members, your employees, employers, you have to make sure they feel like they matter and they belong, and that they feel psychologically safe in the workplace so they can be their best selves. They don't have to cover any identities. They'll be more productive, and there are several benefits to an organization by just telling people they matter and they belong.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really good summary. So I'm going to wrap it up with this. I want to be a CBO, the Certified Belonging Officer. The CBO, right? The idea of belonging, the idea of service. Someone said just this last week, and it resonated with me, that many of us feel like I've done my duty because I did some community service, but I did it for people who look like me. And does that really count as community service, right? I went and did some stuff with my people. But what if we challenged and said, okay, community service really only counts if you're doing it for someone that doesn't look like you, if you're doing it for someone that doesn't have the community, the opportunities. You should feel slightly uncomfortable because you're with someone new, you're outside of your circle, your bubble, and that is when you'll know that you really are learning yourself, because your volunteerism should be less about who you're serving and more about what you are getting from it, because we know you're going to come back for more when you're filled in that way. And it really was this thing where I realized the Drew Lewis Foundation and most nonprofits, when people really come to engage, they leave more transformed than the people they serve. That's why we have the Blue House Project, because we had an individual who said, let's do this project together. And I said, you don't even know what we do. Tom, you come have a seat and see our class. And that changed him more. And now we have a housing initiative because he believed in it in a way that he had never believed before. So, that's really this thing that we're looking at is how can you just as a human every single day make choices, right? It's a choice. Can you engage in choices where even in your daily life, you are choosing to be that chief belonging officer? And let's change the dynamic. It doesn't have to be DEI. We really are talking about belonging, humanization, and honoring people as they are, where they are. And then P.S., it also is good business practice to do that, to stay ahead of the game, because that's where many people are like, just tell me my bottom line. Thriving employees, creating culture that people want to be there, they're going to show up, and they're going to do better at their job because you've created that belonging. So I want to thank you both today for your time, for your voice, for your conversation. I'm really excited about the level this brings with the conversations in the Nonprofit Career Academy, with the students that you're teaching at Drury, and also just with the individuals who tune in with us on Enrichment Today. We thank you for your time, and we challenge you to find ways that you also can create belonging in the people around you. If you're feeling uncomfortable, then you probably know you're in the right place. And just acknowledge that you're uncomfortable and ask questions and learn from others and be that person who's developing belonging or DEI in your community. So thank you so much for your time today and listening in. We look forward to having you again on Enrichment Today.